Please allow me to explain to you how you establish game numbers on a game farm. Um, when you buy a game farm, the game numbers is an important part of the deal and of the purchase price. And buyers want to know what game they are buying with the farm. Um, the seller will normally make a statement. There are so much game on the farm. How do you confirm that? Um, let me kick off by saying to you that game numbers on a game farm is always an estimation. No matter what method you use to count them, it's always an estimation. Um, Obviously, the size of the farm is going to play a role, and also the density of the bush, the season. How if it's a dry season and the trees don't have leaves, or it's wet season and the bush is dense and so on, is all going to play a role. So when you buy a game farm, you the game numbers will be given to you normally in numbers by species, species by species. So the seller will say there are 20 kudu and 50 impala and 25 red hartebeest and so on. You will not break it down further to so many bulls or cows and ages and so on. He will maybe talk about that, but contractually, you only work with the numbers species by species. Except maybe if it's now an exceptional, if it's one of these breeding groups in a small breeding pasture, you got a 50 hectares or the 30 hectares camps and a camp in house 15 yala, and normally you can say accurately what there is, even big males and so on. But that's not the normal situation. The normal situation is you buy a game farm, it's open, there are no breeding camps or breeding pastures, and you must make an estimation of game species by species. When you talk about game numbers on a game farm, normally you do not count in small game and predators that has the ability to go through the fences, like warthog and ribbok and klipspringer and steenbok, and small predators like lynx and jackal and small cats and things like that. They like birds. Birds fly over the fence and they dig holes, they go through. So you will say yes, they occur. There's a lot of them. You can talk about they are there, but you're not going to count them, and you're gonna not gonna calculate their numbers and so on. Now, how you establish game on a game farm? If it's a small farm, I mean, you get farms of 50 hectares, 100, 200 hectares, and it's relatively open here in a Highveld and so on. It's relatively easy to establish the game numbers. But if we talk about a standard size game farm, let's say 500 hectares upwards, so let's talk about your standard full bushveld farm size, 1,000, 1,200 hectares, and it's a bushveld farm. How does a seller know how much game there are, and how do you confirm that? How do you control that when you buy the farm? An owner that's on the farm regularly will have a good idea. He will know that there's a herd of impala there. They are 30, 35. There's a herd of impala there, 15. There's a herd of male impala, 10 male impala there. And kudus there and wildebeest, and nothing will be 100%, but he will have a rough idea if he knows his farm. You can make it more particular by letting people sit at water holes and count the game as they come in. Um, you can get a good idea, but game doesn't drink every day necessarily, and you're gonna maybe see the same game over a period of 2 or 3 days, maybe twice, or maybe never. So it all remains an estimation. Um, in huge reserves like the Kruger National Park, they will fly with fixed-wing aircraft and take photos and count the game that they see on the photos. But that's also not foolproof. You're gonna miss. You're not always gonna be certain that dot is it the animal or not. It's not foolproof, and it's a huge area. When the airplane comes back on another line, this game here may have moved there, so you can count the game twice, or the game that was in that lane moved over here, so you don't count them at all. So it's also not foolproof. Um, when you're buying a game farm, if you're serious about knowing what game is on the farm, the best way for you as buyer to confirm it is with a helicopter. You get a helicopter, you get in with a pilot, and you fly the farm in zones, and you see what you see. You sit with a piece of paper, the species marked off, and every time you see, let's say 10 impala, next to impala you write 10, and so on and so on. So what you see, you write down, and afterwards you calculate. You But it's also not foolproof, because how I explained it to people always is, if you stand upright at the ant nest and the ants are moving, how do you count those ants? Because this game, when the helicopter flies, they're not standing still; they're moving. So there's a lot of room for error, and also uh, you're going to have the same thing. You fly a zone now, and the game that you count runs over the next zone that you fly. You count the game a second time, or the zone that you're flying now, the game that was there moved out back to this zone that you've been flying just now, so you miss them. I had situations where uh, they did a game count with a helicopter, and when the helicopter when they finished and the helicopter lands, what's the word, come down, the owner wasn't satisfied with that was specifically impalas. He said there's a lot more impalas on this farm, and one of the game rangers came forward and he said, "Sir, I was driving around this morning and I saw 50 impala in a dense bush there in a corner of the farm." And they decided they're gonna fly and look for the impala, and lo and behold, they found a troop of 15, a herd of 50 impala that they missed on the original count. Things like that happen because chopper pilots, when you do a game count, is a relatively low fly. You're not flying high. You must fly relatively low, and they must be careful. If you push animals, if you spook the animals into a corner, they may start jumping out through the fence, trying to get through the fence. So a helicopter pilot that do a game count must know what he's doing. He mustn't chase the game through the game fencing. And that's why it can happen often that you miss at corners unless you fly from outside the farm and come over the corner back to the farm, so the game doesn't run into the fence. There are tricks, and it's not. That's why it's an important thing. If there's a game count, the owner always insists to be there, because he can have a lot of damage if the game count is not done properly and the game escapes through fences and things, spooked. So a game count is an important thing. It's not something you do lightly. I read in one of the agricultural magazines once that they did a research on the accuracy of a game count with a helicopter. What they did on a game farm, they chased in, I'm not certain now, I can't remember the numbers. I can't remember the size of the farm and the numbers of but they chased in cattle into the farm. And they just left them there for something like 2 weeks. So the cattle also disperse and they don't stay together. They disperse and they go in different directions and maybe small groups of 2 or 3 and so together. And after, I think, 2 weeks, they used the helicopter. They flew the property and they found much less cattle than that are on the farm. Much less, like 20-30% less, a lot of less. So they missed a lot of the cattle that was on the farm. Eventually, they herded the cattle, and they were all there. So the helicopter missed a lot of the cattle. So that is how they tested this thing, the proof test, as they call it. So that's the one thing you must keep in mind. There's a game count is always an estimation, but the best way to make to satisfy yourself as purchaser is to fly with a helicopter. And when I draft a contract of purchase and sale of a game farm, I never let the seller warrant or guarantee certain game numbers because of this uncertainty on the game count, because that can give rise to litigation afterwards, and you're going to argue about how accurate the game count was. So what I rather say is that I stipulate that the purchaser is allowed to do a game count on his own at his own cost, and satisfy him with what there is and what he see. If he's satisfied, he buys the farm. If he's not satisfied, he can walk away or he can make a lower offer. So that's how I handle it. I don't want to draft a contract in a way that it can give rise to litigation afterwards. And the other question that I sometimes come across with buyers is when the seller make a statement that these game are there, then the buyer will say, okay, I'll do a game count with a helicopter, but the seller must, if the game is not there, the seller must pay, or the seller must pay for the helicopter, or they must share the costs, or so on. No, that's not the way it works. When you want to buy a fixed property, you must make your own investigation as to if you want to buy the property. You drive onto the property, you look around, you look what you see. If you want to test boreholes, you test it at your own cost. If you want to count the game, you count it at your own cost. The purchaser must investigate the property at his own cost. And once he's satisfied that he wants the property, he buys. He can maybe make an offer based on what what his investigation was and so on. What they call it a due diligence. That is all part of your due diligence, and you do it at your own cost. Other issues with game numbers when you buy a farm and you take occupation and so on is the question is, how do you know from the date that you make the count until the date that you as buyer occupies, something bad doesn't happen? You know, it's a gray area and it fluctuates a little bit, fluctuation, and it's an area for negotiation and it's an area for trust. You know, you can do the game count today and tomorrow the owner can move in and maybe hunt one or two of the biggest trophy bulls. Or he won't easily come in at night and harvest a great number of game because that will be too obvious. But things that he think that he can may get away with, or I got the same question with wood. It happened that after the contract has been signed, but before the purchaser occupies, the seller suddenly removes truckloads of wood, sell it, or and it can be valuable wood like leadwood or tamboti and so on. How do you handle these things? Well, what I normally do, the one way to handle it is on the date of occupation. You do the game count, and when the helicopter lands, you pay the deposit unit, and you take occupation, or you pay the full purchase price. That's the one way to handle it. The other way to handle it is to agree in the contract what hunts must still be done and completed. Obviously, if it's a commercial hunting farm and you have hunts booked and deposits paid, you're not going to cancel those hunts. Then you have to agree. You take occupation this day, there are still hunts that must be done. You must agree who's going to do it and for whose benefit. Because hunters, they place an order of they will now hunt this and this and this, so much game. But mostly on the spur of the moment, they'll see something and they say, I want to hunt it and so on. So you can't say that hunt's going to take place and exactly that game is going to be taken off. So you will have to agree as to that this hunt has been booked, deposit has been paid, the hunt is going to continue, who's going to handle it and for whose benefit. And the amount of game that's going to be shot can vary. But okay, that is something different. That is now for commercial hunting. But quite often when a seller sells, he still wants for himself, for old time's sake, hunt he and his son something. And that something can be the biggest bull on the farm. So you have to agree on it. You have to trust each other to a certain extent. And there's a possibility that the moment you sign the contract, from that moment on, you can put your own worker on the farm to uh, to observe and report back to you and so on. But he can be bribed, I suppose. And I never had the situation where the purchaser insisted on this. Never. So at the end of the day, it's an issue of just pay a deposit, a big enough deposit, or the purchase price as quickly as possible, take occupation as quickly as possible, um, and there must be a certain extent of trust there. So yeah, that's how you handle that transition period when you buy the farm. Just as a matter of interest, it's actually not part of this video, but I mentioned the deposit and take occupation of the farm. But how big deposit secure a game farm? The deposit must be big enough to defray any asset stripping. So if a purchaser takes occupation of a property and he strips the property of anything, the deposit must be more than that damage that he can cause. So in practice, my recommendation on a game farm, it's 50% of the purchase price. So normally if a purchaser wants to take occupation, I will recommend that he at least pay into the seller's attorney's trust account at least 50% of the purchase price in cash, um, to defray this possibility of asset stripping. Yeah, so that's basically what I want to tell you about game numbers on a game farm.